His outward appearance hopefully not resembling how he felt about the situation, James bowed before the people gathered within the matriarch's office. "The pleasure is all mine," he lied, before straightening himself up again and repositioning himself, orienting his back in the direction of an empty corner while taking his place between Captain Uton and Reprieg. The rest of their little assembly now closed the circle, looking James over expectantly while he forced himself to look up towards Madame Tua, waiting for her to take action once again. "I have taken the liberty of inviting some other representatives to this little meeting of ours. They are just as interested in forming contacts with the new representative of humanity as I am," the Titan said, gesticulating with her trunk far above James's head. The first person she pointed at was the tortoise-looking Sauropsida. "Here we have a very long acquaintance and colleague of mine," she continued, and the reptile reached their head high up in the air, extending their long, slender neck far out of their shell. "Councilman Kashalangnas Zenchalit, at your service." The seemingly very old man introduced himself, speaking very slowly as he let his head sink down once again. "Although right now I am not here in my position as an advocate to all people, but merely as a representative of the Korstish. Please forgive my intrusion here, but I have been waiting for this day to come, so I could not restrain myself." The man's bulging eyes were transfixed on James in an uncomfortable way. James had only been the human ambassador for a few months now, so if he had been waiting for him, it couldn't have been that long. "If the High Matriarch doesn't have a problem with it, then neither do I," he replied warily, looking back at the old man unsurely. He would have to find out what he meant by that, but flat out asking it would most likely be unwise given his current position. "You worry too much, old boy." Captain Uton's voice rang out from James's side, causing him to surprisingly turn towards the primate. "I assure you, James is a very personable fellow. What do they say on Earth again? The more the merrier?" He nudged against James's arm, as he only stared at him for a moment. Yeah," James answered, slightly taken aback, and chuckled awkwardly. "In that case, I might as well also get introductions over with." The second completely unknown person picked the conversation back up. The villi on their skin shook unsettlingly with each movement they made, and their big mouth opened way too wide while they were talking, showing rows of rasp-like teeth within it. "My name is Councilman Akorte Akun, formerly Councilwoman before my life cycle changed." Good for him, James thought, and acknowledged the brief introduction with a nod of his head. Although at this point some doubt was creeping up on him. He had expected important people important to this station, but councilmen? And two of them at that? How do people like that even have time to meet with them on such short notice? Didn't they have an entire galaxy to run? Well, hopefully he'll be able to entice an answer out of them sometime during this meeting. Apparently noticing that neither James nor the councilman were going to continue the conversation on their own, as they slightly distrustfully stared at each other, the matriarch spoke up again. "That just leaves my dear niece, who you have already met. She may not be quite on the level of company as the rest of us here, but she begged me to come along. And what kind of aunt would I be if I didn't let her? This is also a valuable experience for her as a future matriarch." "Auntie, don't tell him that," the younger woman squealed, and embarrassedly threw her trunk into the air to block her face with it. The display was so utterly ridiculous that not even James could stay afraid of her, if only for a second. "Don't worry about it," he laughed, trying to calm her down. "So far that makes you the most sympathetic person around here." The girl looked down at him with big eyes. "That is cutting, James," Captain Uton said with faint hurtfulness in his voice, although James could also clearly hear his amusement. He rolled his eyes, but didn't look over to him, instead speaking up once again and asking, "So, what may I call you?" Apparently even more embarrassed now, the head of the girl shot up, and she formed the same Y shape with her trunk that James had seen the matriarch use before. "Oh, right," she yelped, and with a crack the control over her voice escaped her for a moment. "My name is Ijin Finora Emenin Tua. It is an honor, Ambassador." James was already sure that he would not remember any of the names he had just learned. At least introductions were out of the way now, and almost everybody present had a title he could use to address them. "I reiterate, the honor is all mine," James said, and repeated his little bow. From his other side, he could hear a disparaging sound escape Reprieg's lips. Had the warrant officer actually learned to see through his facade by now? "Splendid!" the High Matriarch boomed loudly, surprisingly causing not only James to flinch. "Now that everyone is acquainted, we better get going. It is going to be a long day after all, so we shouldn't dawdle." With a wide swing of one part of her split trunk, She indicated for everyone to start moving, while also gesturing for her niece to open the office door for everybody. James hesitated to follow the matriarch's lead a tad longer than everyone else, just standing there for a moment. This caused Uton, who was in the process of walking past him, to nudge against his back with one big hand, as if to entice him to get going already. James looked at him for a moment with an aghast expression, but he quickly remembered his situation and switched to an awkward smile before walking along with the large man. As the entire group made their way through the unsettlingly quiet hall, James used the moment to take another look at his company for the night. The Zodiatos, taking both point and anchor in their little formation, towered over everybody, and seemed to almost sneak along to allow everybody else to keep pace with them. Looking at them, he could still almost feel his blood pressure rise on the spot, but at least his instincts had given up on making him run away at this point, deciding to instead torture him with a constant feeling of looming dread that wasn't helped by the ambiguity of this meeting. The councilman Kashalangas had, just as Captain Uton tended to do, switched to a quadrupedal style of walking, slowly skulking along and forming the limiting factor of the group's speed, as James was fairly certain the old man could not pick up his pace if he held a gun to his head. His contemporary, Akorte, had apparently decided to try his absolute darndest to wrestle the title of most unsettling company from the Zodatios' trunk. As James had expected, the councilman crawled close to the floor with all 8 of his limbs. However, what James had not expected was just how much his movements looked like they weren't built for this way of locomotion. In fact, it looked eerily close to a human crawling along on all fours, landing the movement right in the middle of the uncanny valley. James decided not to look at him too much for the time being. Once again, feeling a soft bump against his arm, he turned towards Captain Uton. With an amused look on his face, the large man lifted the hand he had nudged James with and pointed at one of the statues at the side of the corridor. Confused, James looked over at it, and he raised his eyebrows as he realized what he was looking at. The statue was clearly depicting Captain Uton's people, the example shown being a tall man standing proud and exploratively looking into the room. And now that he looked at it closer, the statue's face was quite familiar. "Got my good side, didn't they?" Uton murmured lowly into James's ear, and let out a quiet chuckle. "They sure did, Captain," James replied, trailing off as he turned his head to look at the statue once again as they walked past it. "Gloating doesn't suit you, Captain." Another voice inserted itself into the conversation, trying painfully hard to sound dignified. James was surprised that he would speak up like that, but he also wouldn't let this opportunity just slip past him. "Are you sure, Warrant Officer?" James answered, and turned his head towards a smaller man walking right behind him. "Gloating makes up about half the things I've ever seen the Captain do." Raprig apparently hadn't expected James to engage him like that, and slightly sank into himself, as James's eyes met with his. "Are all of your comments tonight going to be at my expense, James?" the Captain asked, again in that pretend hurtful tone. James smiled at him, and waved it off. "I just know you can handle it, Captain," he replied, and this time it was him who nudged against the Captain's arm. A croaky laugh rang out from somewhere in front of them, causing the Primate to look for its source. "Why so formal, Ambassador?" the councilman Kashalangas said in a soft, crackly voice. He had turned his head, and with it his entire long neck, around to look at the conversation happening behind him. "Captain, Warrant Officer, Matriarch, titles over titles. We all have titles here, no need to throw them around like that." James looked at the old man confusedly. Every time he had interacted with people with titles so far during his life, they had more than loved throwing them around the whole time. In fact, not using them was usually seen as an insult. "Quite right, old friend," Uton happily agreed and nodded his big head up and down. "This is a friendly gathering, after all." James was absolutely not sure how comfortable he was with that, as the back of his mind slowly started to list reasons why this was just not quite right. Deciding to at least somewhat vent his dissatisfaction, he responded, "Alright then, Faramore, I should probably get used to calling you by your first name anyway." He left the implications of that statement up in the air as both Uton and the councilman looked at him confusedly, although one of the two seemed to have a better idea of what he was saying than the other. They had finally reached the end of the way too long hallway, and once again the young Zodaitos opened the enormous door for everybody. Then she patiently waited right next to the exit, letting everybody else leave before her, and then closing the door behind them again. With big, booming steps that made James's heart fall into his kneecaps, Madame Tua now quickly walked past everyone else, taking the lead from this moment forward. "Alright, everyone follow me, we've got a lot to see," she loudly announced, and without hesitation started to go on ahead, completely confident everyone would follow her. And indeed, the entire group trotted after her. To his own surprise, James found himself sticking surprisingly close to Raprig as they walked, finding it strangely reassuring that he knew pretty well what the rodent thought of him, even if it was nothing good. The captain and reptilian councilman kept trying to make vapid small talk, and he humoured them to a point. However, he was only waiting for a possibility to direct the topic onto something with a bit more substance to it. As he was listening to the councilman describe the history of spacecrafts of the Kordashi people, all the alarms in his head suddenly ran off as his instincts were busy raising every red flag his mind had to offer. The nerves in his neck went crazy, and his hairs actually started to stand up as he ducked down and burst forward a step, very narrowly avoiding the trunk of the matriarch's niece, who had so far been quietly, or as quietly as possible given her size, walked along behind them. James turned on his heels to look at the perceived threat, pressing his right hand on his chest while trying to calm down again, as his pulse and breathing kicked up a gear from the shock. Looking very perturbed by his reaction, the girl lifted her trunk up unsurely. Everyone else also looked at James surprisingly as he came to a stop, and took some deep breaths to regain his composure. "Are you alright, James?" Uton asked. I walked up to him, carefully reaching out a large hand and placing it on his shoulder. James nodded and took one last deep breath before straightening himself up again. "Yeah, I'm fine," he said, and started to pull his uniform back into shape just to give his hands and mind something to do. Just got a bit startled is all. Speaking up for the first time since his introduction, the councilman Akorte aggressively turned towards the young woman, who still looked very much confused by James's reaction to what was most likely her once again attempting to pet him, and scolded her. "Dumb girl, can't you tell already that he doesn't want to be touched?" It was hard to read the reaction on the giant's face, but James could swear that she was once again starting to sulk. "It's okay, really," James said, trying to calm the situation. "Just please don't do that again." "You must forgive her, James." The matriarch herself now spoke up and walked over towards her niece to comfort her. "Looking at you, it is hard to remember that your people come from a world where they need to be on constant alert. No offense, of course." "None taken," James lied, and looked up at the two titans as the matriarch caressed the younger woman's face with her trunk. He wasn't sure if the display creeped him out or if he found it sweet in a very strange way. "How did you even know she was going to touch you?" Reprieve, who had walked up to him from a blind spot of his vision, asked quietly. James shrugged. "Don't know," he replied casually. "I just knew." The face of the warrant officer seemed to darken a bit at that revelation, as he apparently got lost in thought for a moment, his nervous tick of licking his trunk coming through in full force. "If I may be so bold, James," Councilman Kashalinga said, and stretched his neck over towards them, "perhaps it would be best to just humour the young lady one time, just to get it out of her system." That didn't sound like a good idea, found James, since he felt like that would just be rewarding her for her behaviour. And to his surprise, the girl herself quickly answered, "No, thank you, it's fine." Some of the people present seemed to be just as surprised about that as he was. However, given that the situation seemed to be resolved so far, the group quickly reorganised itself into its previous composition. "Don't take it too hard," James tried to assure the young woman once more, before he turned to follow the matriarch, on her way for the station once more. After they had left the monotonous and bleak command area of the station, and re-entered the lived-in part of the GCS, James had to admit, apart from his questionable company, the guided tour was quite something. Their first big stop was a large plaza surrounded by high and extremely clean white buildings, forming an isolated square, seemingly cut off from the rest of the station. The buildings were formed like enormous walls, with windows being speckled across them in seemingly random intervals. More regularly spaced along their bottom were titanic doors, within which smaller doors of progressively diminishing sizes were integrated. And the only entrance and exit to this plaza was formed by enormous archways in what must have been the cardinal directions of the station, even though that concept lost its meaning on a space station. James was in awe as he marvelled at the gigantic walls around him, feeling like an ant in the middle of the Colosseum must feel. He had only seen this on pictures so far, and they didn't do its sheer size any justice. "Quite the sight to see, isn't it?" the councilman Kashalengas commented, chuckling, and looked along the bright walls himself as he stepped up next to James. "It's a shame that they stopped using it before my time. I would have loved to work here." "I can imagine," James mumbled, as he took in the sight with the same gawking gaze that all the other tourists surrounding him right now had on their faces. And he hoped he would be forgiven for that. After all, he stood in the middle of history here. They stood in the middle of the first Galactic House of Councils, also lovingly dubbed the Great Community Palace. It was here that the different precursors and vague core world alliances were formed into the galactic community proper for the first time, and where it was governed for many years to come after. Only after the community and with it its council had grown too large to be housed in this building anymore, which was hard to imagine given the palace's sheer size, had it been retired and turned into a museum and tourist attraction, after an entire news station had been built specifically to house the future galactic councils. Sadly, we don't have time to actually go inside today, Madame Tua stated, looking down at Jane specifically as she looked around. But I can highly recommend going through it at your own time. Since you represent a species that wasn't around for our community's humble beginnings, it could give you some insights into the lengths the first member species went through to build a bright and accommodating future for every member species. Indeed, James would have to come back here one day, not to learn about the past, which he could do comfortably from his own room, but just to walk along this massive structure and take in everything that it entailed. As he let his eyes wander along the walls one more time, something met his eye. There was a plaque along one of them, hanging high up. It was made of some matte goldish metal, and was slightly withered by age. He had mistaken it for the shutters of one of the weirdly shaped windows before, however now he could clearly see that there was something written on there instead. Success to you, prosperity for all, unity in the community, he read out loud, straining his eyes to make out the letters so far above his head. Quite the motto, isn't it? Kashalenga spoke back up as he looked up towards the plaque with a shaky neck. It's a shame people never use the whole thing. It has such a nice sound to it. Nobody has time to say the full thing every time, HFY responded impudently, and waved it off with her trunk. Maybe people should take the time more often, Repeat reminded her, standing off to the side a bit. It could remind them what the community is about. Councilman Accorta made a seemingly agreeing gesture to that, the mini villi on his skin shaking around. The community's motto, huh? James repeated to himself. He was sure he had read that before somewhere, but it hadn't really registered to him until now. A bit embarrassing given that he had been using its beginning as a form of goodbye for months now. It is our honour and privilege to work under it every day, Kashalenga said with an almost nostalgic tone. Always striving to make the community the place our ancestors envisioned when they built this place. There it was. His inn had arrived. It must be hard working as a representative for an entire galaxy, James commented coyly. I looked over to the large old man. If I'm being honest, I'm not even quite comfortable representing just my own species. The old man chuckled. Once you're being reinstated for 30 times, it becomes second nature, my boy, he said softly and looked down at James. James remembered hearing that before. Hadn't the matriarch said something similar during their first meeting? Excuse my ignorance, but what exactly does it mean to be reinstated? He asked, as he had clearly at some point missed something about the way the community was being run. He got a mix of bemused and disapproving looks in response. His lack of common knowledge seemed to either amuse or not at all amuse the people present. After a while it was Reprieg of all people who spoke up to explain it to James. The Galactic Council and other important positions, such as Leader Supreme, are elected quarter-yearly into their respective positions, he said in an almost annoyed tone, disapprovingly wiggling his trunk around as he spoke. But since elections on a galaxy-wide scale are quite cost and labour-intensive, it was decided early on in the community's history that a reinstatement system would be best suited to handle the workload. Instead of running a proper election every election cycle, it is instead first voted on reinstating the already present council. If the majority of people are in favour of keeping the current council, there is no sense in wasting money and effort on a full election just to have the same people re-elected anyway. Going by his tone, he thought something along the lines of, how did you ever become ambassador? Which was a fair question, given that he technically didn't. James looked at him for a moment. Having grown up on Earth, he saw all kinds of problems with that system. And he really meant all kinds. He also ran the numbers over in his head. Reinstated 30 times, once quarter-yearly. Translated to Earth years, that would be about 96 years, wow, he mumbled to himself, and reached for his forehead in a moment of restrained shock. The old geezer had been councilman almost 4 times as long as he had been alive, and for quite some years before they had even made contact with humanity. Well, we can't all still be calves, the matriarch commented. I looked over at James as well as her own niece, who James now noticed seemed also a little surprised by the old man's term of service. Usually James would have and probably should have taken insult to a comment like that. He was a grown-ass man after all. However, seeing that the human lifespan didn't seem to be all that in a galactic context, it couldn't muster any offence. Apparently being the first one to notice that James was in a bit of a predicament at the moment, Captain Uton hurried over to his side and quickly changed the topic. Come to think of it, this next vote coming up will be the first for humanity, right? The last one was still too close to first contact after all. Maybe that will shake things up, he said, while patting James on the back. They'd certainly have the numbers to do so. The councilman Accorte now inserted himself into the conversation, fixating James with his wet, black eyes. and given how detached they have acted so far, it is hard to predict what direction things may take.
Indeed,
Gashalengas agreed with his contemporary.
In the future, humanity may be one of the most important species to agree with you if you want to hold a seat in the council. Quite exciting, don't you think? And I wouldn't be surprised if soon all future councils included at least one human, if not more. If you wanted to, you might be able to join our ranks pretty soon, James.
James listened up at that. Flattering, but I think you may be exaggerating a bit, he said, and tried his best to appear coy at the suggestion. Humanity may be numerous, but enough to swing an entire election? Numerous is putting it lightly, Acorte commented offhandedly, and appeared not at all amused about James playing the airhead.
Wait, just how numerous are we talking?
Ajifionora asked surprisedly and looked down at James, who she apparently had not taken quite so seriously up until now. James awkwardly scratched his neck and looked off into empty space as he answered. Well, 20 billion-ish, in our home system, that is. I don't really know much about the numbers in our outer colonies. The young woman looked down at him with a gaze of pure disbelief. Wait, did you say 20 billion? Reprieve suddenly barged in, and his face had turned from his usual disparagement to a quite perturbed expression. You are telling me your home system alone could balance out those of 20 other species? The flabbergasted look in his eyes was priceless, found James, but he tried to stay more professional than that. Maybe. It depends on the species, I guess, he answered nonchalantly, although he had to admit that did put things into perspective for him. He had only ever known the human population to be quite large compared to other species, but thanks to Reprieve's helpful outburst, he now had a point of reference for how large populations were supposed to be.
You are right, of course. While that is an impressive number, it alone is still not enough to decide an entire election necessarily.
The matriarch rejoined the conversation, and James tried to discreetly take a few steps away from her as she came closer.
However, do not underestimate the influence the human vote could have on the other member species.
Her constantly fluttering ears seemed to speed up even further as she said that, making their shadow dance wildly in front of James's feet. I'm not sure I understand, he answered, looking up to the Colossus nervously and straining his eyes to focus on her face. The many eyes of the Leader Supreme narrowed down on him, and he wondered how well she was actually able to see him from all the way up there.
You may not be core worlders, but you are still primates, she explained slowly, and sounded almost amused. People will look towards your people for reassurance, and if such a massive and esteemed people start to move into a direction, many others will surely follow. Just look at us. We had our positions for many years because our people trust us, and the community trusts our people.
There they were again, the esteemed primates. And given what he had just heard, the esteemed Proboscis and the esteemed Testudinas could apparently join the club. You think so? James answered thoughtfully, and brought a hand up to his chin as he considered it. At least it slowly made some sense why he was invited here, and with such important company in that, although some questions were still left unanswered.
I am sure of it,
the matriarch replied with a wide movement of her trunk. Then she lifted her head up high and added more loudly,
But we've been here long enough now, it is time for us to continue. We don't want to be late for our meal, after all.
This time, James's brain had been given something to chew on while they walked through the colourful streets of the station, surrounded by all kinds of different cultures clashing and mixing with each other in the different store and house fronts. There was hardly a place one could look without seeing something that seemed strange and alien in at least one aspect, be it weird architecture, a displeasing colour scheme, or unfamiliar utilities. Combining that with the abnormally huge size of everything, it was easy to get overwhelmed. Over their heads, a constant stream of people was busily walking along the elevated site-specific walkways, which they didn't use due to their wildly differing sizes. Even further above them, the suspension railways were constantly going back and forth between different stations, their rails forming a sort of mesh separating the station's ground and ceiling. Their next goals weren't quite as exciting as the Great Community Palace had been. Mostly different embassies or outposts, wedged in between storefronts or small communities of people from their worlds. Most were pretty unassuming and showed little in the way of what culture they represented, the houses and stores around them being better indicators of the way of life they brought to the station. The Koroshtich, for example, had no doors in sight, apparently living completely open and disclosed to everyone. The Sipper slang, which had turned out to be Reprieve's people from the Deathworld Tshirt, on the other hand, lived very much isolated from each other, apparently enjoying individual, small, tight, and easily maintained rooms as their domains of choice. James was slightly confused as to why exactly he was shown these places, but was never asked to enter and talk to any of the other ambassadors. To him it seemed a little counterintuitive. He also wondered why he wasn't shown any of the more interesting facilities, like maybe water preparation, or any agricultural areas maybe. Or even something like the oxygen production. That would have to be interesting to see. The whole time, he still felt like he was basically being groomed, with the matriarch and Councilman Kashlengas constantly trying to talk him up in a multitude of strange and unfitting ways, while looking at symbols of diplomacy, just without the practical part. Right now, the honest-seeming naivety of Afinia Nora and the quite obvious distrustfulness of Reprig and Akorte were somehow reassuring in comparison. After he had gotten mere glimpses into what the galaxy had to offer, it seemed that they were already done with their little tour. Wordlessly, they followed Madame Tour towards the very side of the station, where just about the biggest wall James had ever seen towered all the way up to the ceiling. He looked along its blank metal surface and noticed that they were heading towards the only place far and wide that seemed to have an identifying feature. To him, it looked like a poorly hidden entrance, to the point where maybe it wasn't supposed to be hidden at all. Number bats were placed alongside the wall at multiple different heights, seemingly randomly, if one didn't notice the fine lines running along the wall just beside them, which clearly belonged to a door. Who knew, maybe it was just a minimalism thing, and it was only supposed to be subtle. He made sure to get a good look at the code the matriarch was inputting into the pad. 53719. He immediately started repeating the numbers in his head, as he watched the door first slide back a small bit, and then out of the way, disappearing behind the rest of the wall.
Surely you remember that I promised to take you behind the scenes, so to speak, the matriarch said, while turning towards James and giving him an almost cheery look. James wasn't all that impressed yet, but he played along and interestingly looked into the brightly lit hall in front of them. After the entire group had been ushered in, the hidden door closed behind them again. The room they walked into was smaller than most of the places they had been to today, and looked almost sterile, the clean white walls reminding James of a hospital. However, going forward a bit, it opened up into a slightly larger tunnel, running along in both directions, a rail running right through its middle. A thick red line on the ground apparently marked the danger zone, and showed that it would probably not be wise to enter the tunnel on foot. James looked up towards his guide expectantly. The matriarch was already busy pressing a conveniently placed button on the wall, after which he seemingly waited for a moment. In a station of this size, it is sometimes necessary for the right people to get from point A to point B in a timely fashion, she said, looking down at him. She waved him over, and James quickly noted that everyone else was already gathering up in single file right before the red line. People like us can't always rely on the usual means of transportation around here. A soft breeze striking across his face indicated that something big was moving through the tunnel from his left, and he interestedly walked past the line of people and leaned slightly into the danger zone to see what was coming. Almost immediately, he felt himself be pulled back by his jacket as an agitated Reprig asked him, "What are you doing? Stay back, for goodness sake." With an annoyed grunt, James pushed the man off of him and leaned forward again, as bright lights were coming closer through the tunnel. The wind blowing against him got stronger, and he had to narrow his eyes while looking in its direction. Already he could hear whatever was coming start to slow down, the brakes loudly screeching as the massive thing needed to lose its velocity before arriving at their stop. Having slowed down to nearly a walking pace, it finally emerged from the tunnel and stopped right where the line of people waiting to enter had formed. It was a huge, sleek, tube-like train lacking any windows. It glided along the single rail as if it was levitating, which it probably was now that James thought about it. The surface was polished to the point that James could vaguely make out his reflection on the cabin's white exterior, as next to him, a door loudly started to open. Of course, just as with a very expensive car, the door opened upwards, as if he needed any more indication that this thing was pure opulence. Treating this as an everyday experience, everyone quickly entered the comparatively small cabin. Of course, you could have probably transported hundreds of humans with this. However, with 2 Zodatios on board, it became clear that this was supposed to be a bit more of an intimate experience. The inside of the tube was basically equipped like a limousine, just without the seats. Fridges and other comfort articles were lined along the walls, and many of the people around him were quick to help themselves to various drinks and small snacks, while the matriarchs seemingly related their destination to the driver of the high-speed train. Seeing that everyone seemed distracted for the moment, James decided to pull out of the group for a moment, positioning himself into a far-off corner to gather his thoughts. He had made some headway playing nice this whole time, but it was exhausting being surrounded by people he didn't enjoy the company of, and while he had gathered hints as to what was going on around him, it was nowhere near enough yet, which meant he would have to go more into the offensive at the dinner table. Maybe the intimacy of the situation would at least make them talkative. He felt the train coming into motion below his feet, so he closed his eyes and leaned against the wall so he wouldn't have to fight against the inertia. A bit overwhelming, huh?
A soft, low voice said, slowly approaching him. Was it like this for you? James asked the captain without opening his eyes again.
If you believe it, it was worse.
The captain laughed, and James could hear the large man sit down in front of him.
You are handling this pretty well. I take it you have experience with the big leagues.
James laughed softly. Like you wouldn't believe, he retorted sarcastically, and stretched his neck left to right until a satisfying crack sounded from his vertebrae. Hearing the other members of their little party still stand a good bit away from him, James let his guard down ever so slightly while talking to the captain alone. I'm afraid I can't really give you all what you want from me if I don't find out what it is, he said, finally looking over towards the fellow primate. Uton took a deep breath and curled his thin lips into a smile.
I guess you're right,
the large man said, and picked at some strands of the fur around his neck with his right hand.
But you shouldn't worry about that.
Easier said than done, James replied. I looked away from the captain and at the wall for a moment. I'm a Deathworlder, remember? Worrying is in my blood. As always, when he casually brought up his classification, he was rewarded with a strange look, expressing a modicum of concern, even if this wasn't news for the captain in the slightest.
Well, right now you are mostly a primate, so even if it seems hard, try to take things with a bit of humour, won't you?
Uton said encouragingly, and reached out to put a large hand on James's shoulder. James looked back at the captain, then over at the rest of their group, and then back to the captain. Taking a deep breath, he remembered the first time the captain brought this up, back when his arm was being stitched up by Thither. Back when he probably should have realised the weight of being a primate, even, or maybe especially, as a Deathworlder. Say, Faramore, James said, honouring his previous agreement to let titles be titles for now. Even though I've heard it before, I never thought much of it, but now I do have to wonder, what is supposed to be so special about us primates? Uton looked surprised at his question, but apparently James's gaze was earnest enough to not make him question it. The large man loudly breathed out with pursed lips and reached for his head, rubbing across it while thinking.
Oh, well, where do I start with that?
He said ruminatively, and crossed his arms in front of his chest while looking up at the ceiling.
Since the dawn of the galactic community, us primates have been renowned for our quick wits and supposedly exceptional curiosity, with the intelligence to back them up. I can't tell you exactly how it started, but I think it must have been like this since my people helped found the community itself. Among the many species that joined since then, it is not quite so fitting anymore to call all primates smarter than any other order. But the belief stuck around, and even new members picked it up over time. I couldn't tell you why. You'll probably have to ask a historian to find out more about that.
And just some stupid old belief has this much impact? James asked, more himself than the captain, as he thought back to the times of rule seemingly being bent around him in places. There has to be more to it. The captain looked at him worriedly as James got lost in thought. However, the screeching of brakes and the pull of inertia on their bodies informed the two of them that they were quickly nearing their destination.